domestic violence and child abuse, and we're talking to Dr. Edna Lockert, who is an associate professor in clinical psychology at Meharry Medical College. And welcome to Black Pulse, Dr. Lockert.
Thank you, Dr. Haney.
Dr. Lockert, we've talked about child abuse, and I would like for you, as a person who has been involved in this area for some time, to give us some of the causes of child abuse, and from your experience, to simply talk about the relationship and causes of child abuse.
The causes of child abuse, Dr. Haney, are multiple. Nevertheless, most authorities will discuss child abuse in terms of three main factors. The first factor would have to do with the personality of the parent or caretaker who is rearing the child or taking care of the child. The second factor would have to do with certain characteristics of the child himself or herself, which might happen to render the child more vulnerable to becoming a subject or target for abuse. And the third factor would be factors of environmental stress or domestic strife, as we have discussed here earlier today. Those factors also impact on child abuse. And I'd like to elaborate on each one of those, if I might. With respect to the personality of parents or caretakers, sometimes we talk about abuse proneness or an abuse-prone parent. And researchers have discovered that an abuse-prone parent is one who has low self-control, the sort of person who may have what in the vernacular we may call a short temper or a short fuse. But we speak of poor impulse control or low self-control. They're likely to have low self-esteem, and they're likely to be persons who tend to project their own inadequacies, either real or imagined inadequacies, onto the child. And when the child does not meet the expectations of the parent for the kind of love or appreciation that the parent is looking for, then the parent may become enraged and take that out on the child with abusive patterns. With respect to the child, any physical illness or behavioral difference or attribute which impacts on the burden of child care may tend to make that child somewhat more vulnerable to abuse from abuse-prone persons. For example, if the child was premature, if the child suffers from some chronic illness, if the child has behavior management problems that make it more difficult for an already stressed parent to handle the child, then that child is likely to be a target of abusive behavior on the part of parents. Then in terms of the environment, any environmental stress or domestic strife may contribute, may trigger, in other words, child abuse, or may affect the delicate balance that exists between sometimes very low resources for taking care of children in the home and the pressures of child care.
And you call these environmental factors?
Yes, there are many environmental factors. Domestic strife would be one, certainly there in terms of the family environment. And certainly environment conditions that are so rampant today, such as unemployment, overcrowded conditions, etc., can contribute to those factors which can add to the impetus for child abuse in abuse-prone persons. And as has been emphasized here earlier, we find so many times that the abusive parent has been a child or has been a person who was abused himself or herself. And there's a need for that particular parent to have a great deal of love and appreciation from the child. And as I noted earlier, if the parent does not get this, if the child does not meet the expectations of the parent, then sometimes the parent loses the self-control and takes it out on the child in an abusive way.
This seems to be a tremendous social problem as well as an economic problem. How would you suggest that we might be able to better deal with the problems of child abuse? And of course, we've said nothing about the relationship between domestic violence and child abuse, but how can we deal with something like that?
As members of the community, we certainly need to do several things. First of all, we need to raise public awareness of child abuse, the public consciousness about it, as we're doing with programs like this. Secondly, we need to educate all persons who have the privilege and the pleasure of working with parents, of working with families, to recognize abuse proneness and to take steps to prevent abuse. This includes educating healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, teachers, ministers, neighbors, friends, all persons with reference to abuse proneness, so that these persons can step in, can intercede, and can add tactics and can do things that will help to prevent child abuse from taking place.
Very well. Is there anything that you'd like to say as a perhaps a final word in terms of identifying those folks who are guilty, perhaps, of being abusive toward their children? Is there any kind of information that you might give the community whereby we might be able to identify such persons, or perhaps even to know whether or not we ourselves, as members of the community, the viewing audience, might represent such personalities?
Well, yes, certainly if persons have had any history in the past of having abused children in the past, that would be one thing that community persons can look for. Persons who have histories of mental illness or criminal behavior also would be something else that we might note. We need to be aware also that alcoholism or other substance usage may sometimes impair parents or caretakers' ability to exercise self-control and to perceive the needs of children. And we also need to be aware of those types of behaviors among persons in the community.
Very well. I think that we've basically given most of the causes and some of the symptoms of child abuse and domestic violence. Let me thank you and the other members of the panel for coming by and talking about this very important topic. Now, we've got about a minute to go, and in reference to the bill that was spoken of earlier, do you think that there is a need for such a bill?
I think that there is a need for considerable legislation with reference to child abuse. As Representative Love has indicated, it is a problem of tremendous proportions, and it has not been given the attention in legal ways that it should have. As a matter of fact, laws mandating reporting incidents of child abuse have been dated since the mid-1960s, and we know that there have been many cases reported since that time.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Lockert, and let me invite you to tune in again next week for another informative edition of the Black Pulse of Nashville.